Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu, melech haolam, asher kirishanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. La'asok b'divrei Torah, la'asok b'divrei Torah. La'asok b'divrei Torah, la'asok b'divrei Torah. As always, we start with giving some charity. Make sure you put some charity in your charity box. Always, 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 especially in these times. Make sure you give it to someone. And let's talk about what we're going to do tonight. Tonight will be a relatively short class because it's an extremely challenging topic. And it's not something that can really be taught, but needs to be. It's one of the defining moments in Judaism, the Holocaust. Also called the Shoah, which means a conflagration or this huge destruction by fire. There are no words for the Shoah, for the Holocaust. It is unique in human history. There's been many persecutions throughout the world, but they've always had a reason: land, power, religion, money, whatever it may be. The Holocaust is the only example in all of recorded human history where there's been a persecution of a people and there was no gain for the persecutor. They didn't gain land. They didn't gain property. They didn't gain money. In fact, the Holocaust was an extremely expensive proposition for the Germans. It was a destruction of a people for zero purpose other than they wanted to destroy the Jewish people. You can go to the Shoah Museum, to the Holocaust Museum, and that's a really good way to try and understand some of this. There's a movie called Night and Fog. You can see it on YouTube. I think it's in 12 different parts. It's not suitable for children. It's extremely disturbing. It talks about these camps, Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, Dachau, Babi Yar, Pizza Babi Yar, different places. And it shows things. It'll show a close-up on a pair of eyeglasses, and then it will pull back, and it will be a mountain of eyeglasses 2 stories tall from people who were gassed. It'll show some hair, and then pull back, and you'll see a 4-story high pile of hair that had been shorn, had been cut from Jews before they had gone into the chambers, and which was used to make pillows for Germany. If you watch this documentary, you will see parchment made of human skin from the Jews that was used as lampshades, and film footage of it being made into lampshades made by the German government. There just aren't words for this. There are movies, there's Schindler's List, obviously. I actually don't recommend Life is Beautiful. It's a wonderful movie, but it's not at all accurate or an accurate depiction of the Holocaust. But let's talk for a few moments about what caused the Holocaust and how it got to where it is. You might remember that we had this challenge when we talked about the roots of anti-Semitism, that if we go back, the Gospels are written as a polemic against the Jewish establishment. And so there's a lot of writings in the Gospels that are, by definition, anti-Semitic. As we discussed, the Jews could not have been involved in a trial. It was during Passover or maybe Sukkot, but either way, there was no way they could have been in a public trial. A lot of these things. But the Jews did persecute the early Christians in the first couple of centuries. And so the Gospels, which are written from 70 to 150 years after Jesus' death, are written in a way that creates a hatred against the Jewish establishment, that is perpetuated with the idea that how can the Jewish people survive if, according to the Gospels, we killed God? How can we survive, let alone thrive? And that manifests ultimately in 1144 in Norwich, England. As you may recall, we discussed about the blood libel, that this priest in Norwich said that the disappearance of a young Catholic boy was because of the Jews using a child's blood for matzah. It's perpetuated farther with the horns, the issue of mistranslation in the Vulgate. Again, this is in past classes. The 4th century, the mistranslation of the Torah so that it doesn't say that Moses came down from Mount Sinai with light shining from his forehead, but rather he had horns. Michelangelo makes that into the famous statue of Moses with the horns. And so it becomes an urban myth, a cultural myth, whatever you want to call it, that the Jews killed God, drink blood, and have horns, and are associated with the devil. Anti-Semitism is a vital part of Europe, especially when we get into Eastern Europe, Northern Europe. Not as much in Spain, Morocco, Portugal, specifically in Europe, but especially as we get into farther and farther north. And so after World War I, when the Germans lose the war and their economy is in the toilet, a very charismatic leader, very charismatic man, who was a political activist, a social group kind of guy. And if this in a very frighteningly way, a scary way, reminds you of things today, then you're seeing things accurately. He writes a biography. He's very charismatic, called My Story, Mein Kampf. And he is doing social activism, political activism. And he gathers the different groups that feel disenfranchised. All Germany's in the toilet. Economy's horrible. You probably remember pictures when you're in high school or middle school of Germans carrying a cartload of money just to buy a loaf of bread. The economy is awful. And he starts to take these different disenfranchised groups and coalesce them together. And he has the National Socialist Party. And as part of it, he blames all the problems in Germany on the Jews. The Jewish conspiracy, on the Jews. Even though, remember, there had been Jews for hundreds of years in Germany. Many Jews were medal winners in World War I fighting for Germany. Didn't matter. The Jews are still the outsider, and he blamed them. And Hitler grew to power. May his name be blotted out from the universe. He was elected. Let's remember this. He was elected into office. He didn't become a dictator by saying, I'm a dictator. He was elected. And he systematically came after the Jews, identifying Jewish products by having a star on them, getting to a place of identifying Jews by having a yellow star on them, ultimately creating the death camps, the concentration camps, where Jews would be taken in train cars to a quote-unquote nice relocation camp. There, they'd be stuffed into train cars like sardines, and there is one locally. My friend Stanley Black arranged to purchase the last train car that went to Auschwitz. He and Severin Ashkenazi, God bless them both, purchased the last train car to Auschwitz, and it is at the Jet Center in Granada Hills. You can go see it. It's tiny, and hundreds of Jews were stacked in like sardines. They'd get out, they'd be told, go shower, and the showers were filled with Zyklon B gas, and they would be gassed to death and then burned in incinerators. It's the natural conclusion of the argument that had been going on, or that the Jews killed God, the Jews drink blood, the Jews have horns. Why not kill them? They were considered an inferior race. And 6.5 million of our brothers and sisters were killed for no purpose. The stories are horrible. The cost of these concentration camps was huge. And there are many Holocaust survivors who have demonstrated that they are as or more upset at the English and American and French than they are the Germans, because every day those planes would fly over the concentration camps like Auschwitz, fly over to bomb railroads or whatever. They could have bombed the gas chambers. They could have bombed the incinerators. They didn't. There are no words to express it. There's a book called Mila 18 about the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt by Leon Uris. It's a powerful book. As I say, Schindler's List, a number of different things. But there are no words to express this hatred, this very focused determination to destroy the Jewish people. So much so, and Hitler really thought what he was doing was good for the world. So you got to understand, he didn't have delusions that this was helping his war effort. He was doing this because he thought it was good for the world. Hitler filmed all sorts of things from the camps, and he took Torah scrolls from different communities when he destroyed those communities, because he thought that he would create a museum for the extinct race, and the world would be happy to see that. We're very blessed. We actually, you can barely see it here. This is actually a Holocaust Torah right here. It is a Shoah Torah. He thought what he was doing was the right thing to do. And the torture, because after all, Jews, again, they were considered subhuman. The torture that was done to Jewish communities. Rabbi, urinate on this Torah, or we're going to take that kid and throw him against the wall and kill him. Or they would play a game. Who could throw a baby, a child, against the wall and splatter their heads from the farthest distance? These kind of things. The experiments that were done on Jews, because after all, again, they're just subhuman. The horrible experiments, the medical experiments. And the horrible ways and things they did. Not just the camps. The pits of Babi Yar, where for days they had these Jews line up big pits, and then they would stand and they would just shoot them, and even if they weren't dead, they'd fall over because they were wounded, and the dead bodies would come on top of them. The pits of Babi Yar. If you go to Hungary, you go to Budapest, I believe it's Budapest, there is a pathway along the Danube. And in one area, there are all these bronze shoes, because as the war was not going well, my friend Andy Stevens was actually watching it from the other side of the river. Andy wrote an amazing book called Rebel with a Cause. He was one of the heads of the underground in Hungary. He was the head forger in the Hungarian underground. Saved countless lives. A real hero. And not a lot of heroes in this world that I've ever met. Andy Stevens is truly a hero. And the Germans, to save bullets, would tie 3 Jews together and then shoot the one in the middle and throw them off into the ice-cold Danube so they would all drown and freeze. And so there's a memorial of these boots. The horrors they did. And it's interesting that in the midst of these horrors, there was also faith. there were some amazing, amazing actions. The story is that in Auschwitz, the rabbis in Auschwitz took God to trial for breaking the covenant with his people. They were rabbis defending God, rabbis prosecuting God, and then the Beit Din, the judges. Only rabbis would be so arrogant as to take God on trial. By the time dawn came around, they had decided that God did break the covenant, and then they all went out and did their morning prayers, because even though they felt that from their perspective they couldn't understand it, they still had faith there was a reason. There's the story of the Warsaw Ghetto. If you want a historical fiction book, I really recommend Mila 18 by Leon Uris. Warsaw was the Paris of Poland, and they took all the Jews and they condensed them to a little ghetto. And they built bunkers underneath their buildings. And on April 19th, in 1943, the very first night of Passover, Pesach, they raised a Jewish flag, and they had an uprising rebellion. It lasted for 7 weeks, but then it continued. They ultimately did not clear out the entire ghetto. I think it was something like 7 months. Ragtag Jews fighting with Molotov cocktails, going in and impersonating Germans, kill German soldiers' uniforms, putting them on, impersonating Germans, going into munitions factories, things like this. And the ghetto was the first time since the destruction of ancient Israel that the Jews they flew a flag. There was a man there. You know, we're always taught in our tradition that we have rabbis, we have teachers whom we have never met, who may have died before we were born. For me, one of those men is Rabbi Kalinimus Kalman Shapiro, called the Piaseczna Rebbe, Piaseczna being a suburb of Warsaw. He was the head of the Jewish community. By the time I think he was 16 or 17 years old, he was just a real amazing being. You got to be a pretty holy man to be a rabbi in your late teens in pre-World War II Europe. He had a huge yeshiva, and it's said that he would spend. The 70-year-old man came with his 7-year-old grandson. He spent 5 minutes with the old man and hours with the child. You can look online on Facebook or on YouTube, I believe. I told some of his stories this past high holidays. The greatest thing in the world is to do someone else a favor. Is a teaching of the Piaseczna Rebbe. Such a holy man that he could have gotten out, but he went into the ghetto with his people. His wife died, his son died. At Simchas Torah, his wife and son had died, I believe, during Sukkot. And Simchas Torah, people gathered, and some people said, he's not coming, his beloved child, his beloved wife, they've died. Others said, no, he'll come. And apparently he came to a basement where it was prohibited, and holding the Torah, chanted, and apparently everyone there was lifted to the heights of heaven in the midst of hell. After World War II ended, an American soldier found a cask, and it had writing on top that he couldn't read, but it was Hebrew. So he brought it to the chaplain, the rabbi, and it said on it in Hebrew and Yiddish and in Polish, whoever takes these writings to Israel and publishes them, I promise that you and your descendants will be blessed. And it was his Devar Torahs, his teachings from the midst of the Warsaw Ghetto while he was surrounded by the South. They were published as a book. The book was called Eish Kodesh, Holy Fire, Sacred Fire. This is an edition of it in English. And it's his teachings, his sermons. They're powerful on their own. They're meaningful on their own. They're uplifting on their own. When you think of them having been written in this hell, they are beyond powerful. I can't read more than 2 or 3 pages. I start sobbing. I recommend it highly if you want to understand some real deep Jewish theology. It's a very, very powerful book, his teachings. And so, as we know, ultimately the Allies won the war, thank God. And they liberated the camps. Again, this film, Night and Fog, has a combination of footage that Hitler had filmed and footage that the Allies filmed when they liberated the camps, because they said no human being will ever believe this happened, and we need to document it, otherwise no one will believe it. And there are plenty of Holocaust deniers now, as we know, including some in political office. And the camps were liberated in 1948, partially as a result of the guilt. We had the creation of the State of Israel, of the modern State of Israel. And from 1945 to roughly the late 70s, early 80s, anti-Semitism was put in a closet. They were still anti-Semites. You don't get rid of 2,000 years of inbreeding and hatred so quickly or so easily, but no one wanted to admit they were anti-Semites because, the Holocaust just happened. By the time you get into the 80s, you start having, in the late 70s even, anti-Semitism becomes couched as anti-Israel. So it's not okay to say you're against Jews, but it's okay to say you're against Israel. And by the time you get into this millennia of the 2000s, and certainly the last 10 years, 12 years specifically, people are okay saying anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic things as opposed to just anti-Israel. There have been attempts to label all products from Israel with a yellow star, or from the West Bank with a yellow star. We have politicians like Tlaib and Omar. And I don't care what side of the aisle you are on, right or left, Democrat or Republican. You need to work to remove those kind of anti-Semites who want each of us dead. Let's be clear about that. Who have the audacity to make the comments that they make. And the cowardice of people, our own brothers like Congressman Schiff or Senator Schumer, who have remained silent and not censured them. We have an obligation to call out that kind of anti-Semitism, if only to honor the 6.5 million who died, as well as to make sure it never happens again. So the Holocaust, which was such a significant and substantial part of many of our upbringing because we grew up in that generation between 1945 and the late 70s, is often not even talked about in modern school books, the California school curriculum. Just today I was sent an email or text about the California school curriculum, and I will that they are embracing critical ethnic studies, which say the Jews are privileged in the California high schools. Same Hazarai, the same trope promoted by Hitler prior to us having camps. And so we need to stop it where it happens. And I think this may be the lesson of the Holocaust. I cannot convey the feelings or the experiences. Thank God I wasn't there. When I was asked a number of years ago to speak at the 1939 Club, they were sponsoring an event talking about shofar and Rosh Hashanah. And I actually got up and said, academics, and because I was an academic and a rabbi, I actually closed it out and said that to the 1939 Club is a group of survivors and their children. And I said, I have no place to speak to you about faith or Judaism or God or anything else. You've all survived hell. What I do have is the ability to lead us all in the prayer of the Kaddish, the sanctification of God's name. And afterwards, I talked to a number of them who were so grateful. They came up afterwards and said, Rabbi, it was so nice not to have someone try and lecture to us about God, but rather to realize that they were overwhelmed and just pray with us. But I think the most important thing to come out of the Holocaust today, 2021, is something by a man named Emil Fackenheim. By the time we get into the 1960s and 70s, we start having this area of scholastic or philosophical thinking called post-Shoah theology. How do we reconcile a belief in God with the fact that the Holocaust happened? For the first 30 years, it was just too sore. And then by the time you get into the 60s and 70s, you start getting some different people who talk about it. And a number of things happen. One is we have the holiday of Yom HaShoah. Many of you have heard of that. It's the Holocaust Remembrance Day, except that's not the name of the holiday. The holiday is called Yom HaShoah Ugevura. Yom HaShoah, the day of the destruction, Ugevura, and of strength. Holocaust Remembrance Day is not about just remembering about the Holocaust. It's about committing ourselves and having the strength to never let it happen again anywhere. To understand that when anyone compares any politician to Adolf Hitler, we need to stop them right then and there. Thank God there's never been another being as horrific as that. And to compare anyone, again, I don't care if it's a Democrat comparing Trump. I don't care if it's a Republican comparing Obama. No one compares to Hitler. Nothing compares to the Holocaust. And we need to call that out. Ugevura. And strength. And we need to be strong. So that holiday comes out, but one of the things that comes out of post-Shoah theology is there's this thinker, a man named Emil Fackenheim. And he writes this very powerful essay. It's entitled The 614th Commandment. There are 613 commandments in the Torah. Fackenheim posits we should add a 614th commandment to what the Torah is. We should add a commandment. Thou shalt not let Hitler have a posthumous victory. Every time we allow an anti-Semite to be an anti-Semite and not call him out on it, we're letting Hitler win. Every time we turn ourselves away from our tradition to be secular, to be assimilated, to say I'm more of an American than I am a Jew, whatever it may be, we are letting Hitler win. And let's be clear about something. And I believe this will happen in our or our children's lifetimes. All of us are or will be asked the question, are you an American who happens to be Jewish or a Jew living in America? And whatever your answer is, which is fine, we all need to realize that for the non-Jewish world, we are all the outsider, the Jews living in America. That is the reality. To deny it is fantasy. We have an obligation to step up, to not let Hitler have that posthumous victory, to be true to our rituals, to be true to the Torah, to be true to our teachings. That doesn't mean that you need to go be Shomer Shabbos. Great if you do. But it means that we need to recognize we are Jews. We need to say what Moses said 3,700 years ago, Ivri Anochi, I am a Jew. We need to stand proudly that way, and we need to stand loudly that way. And when someone comes out like an Omar or a Tlaib or a BLM, the leader of BLM in Los Angeles, is a self-proclaimed disciple of Farrakhan. I'm not discounting the movement. I'm not saying there's not validity in it. I'm talking about the organization. Let's be clear. The organization is very clear. They want Israel destroyed. They don't want Jews around. When Melina Abdullah, the head of Los Angeles BLM, was asked, why are you rioting in the Jewish neighborhood? There's no city hall there. There's no federal building. Her answer, and I quote, and you can look it up. Her answer was, I wanted the people there to feel pain. If we don't call out those anti-Semites, we are letting Hitler have a posthumous victory. If we are not teaching this to our children, we are letting Hitler win. It is our obligation and our blessing and our privilege to be the ethical conscience of the world. And part of that means having the courage to stand up and say, I am a Jew. Years ago, I was leading services at a synagogue, and a very nice old lady came up. And she said, Rabbi, I really love what you have to say. I love watching you pray. I know it's real for you, but can you speak? Can you pray a little softer? It's too loud. I don't want anyone to hear us. I had a long conversation with her and explained, no. We need to be proud of our prayers, proud of our tradition. We need to have a pride in who we are. If you're an adult and you haven't had a bar or bat mitzvah, well, then you know what? Email the temple. We'll help you get one. If you have children and they're 10, 11, 12, or if you know people who have children and the family can't afford a bar or bat mitzvah, you email the temple. We have a free bar and bat mitzvah program, and the reason of it is so that no one has an excuse to not educate their children in a Jewish way. This is what we need to do. We need to be proactive for Judaism and protective of Jews. And we need to call out anti-Semites for what they are. It is so, so important. Because as Fackenheim says, there should be a 614th commandment that thou shalt not let Hitler have a posthumous victory. I really want to recommend maybe reading Mile 18. It's a beautiful book. It's historical fiction, but it'll give you a taste. Watching Life is Beautiful will give you a taste. Watching Night and Fog, if you have the courage. And I recommend it for every Jew. I recommend it for every human, actually. You can find it on YouTube. It's a documentary. You may not be able to watch it all in one sitting. You may want to just watch one part at a time. But to watch it, to have faith, read something like this. So when it seems like it is getting so dark, realize what greatness, what great rabbis also were saying. This is one of the greatest Hasidic rabbis in that hell. When we think of these names, Buchenwald, Mauthausen, Bergen-Belsen, Treblinka, we think of Auschwitz, which had its gates, work will set you free. We need to also remember Fackenheim's 614th commandment. And as each individual and as communities, we need to make sure that we don't let Hitler have a posthumous victory. This Wednesday night, January 27th, 7:30 p.m. is Tu B'Shvat. We will be having a virtual Tu B'Shvat Seder on our synagogue. You should have gotten an email about it, and other emails will come out. We'll be doing it as a Zoom so people can participate a little bit more actively. If it overflows, then we'll go to Facebook or the website as well. But so I want to invite you to come do that. It's a beautiful holiday. It's especially a holiday of healing. I apologize for being so passionate in terms of being so discussing this dark, dark stuff. There is no easy way to discuss it, but it is so, so important that we recognize what has happened and never let it happen again. To see you this Wednesday, Tu B'Shvat. And next week for class again. Thank you for being kind, as always, and studying together. Shalom.